Professor Freitag is a professor of oceanography. He is with the Marine Advisory Program Alaska Sea Grant. He is out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. However, he has been down in Ketchikan living here since 1976. He's been a professor of oceanography with the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences since 2008, so that's over 13 years. And he has had an extremely distinguished tenure of service with us at the University of Alaska, so much so that as he is retiring, he has been recently dubbed for a Professor Emeritus position. So we would just like to extend a great thank you to Professor Freitag, and he will talk to us now about plankton.
All right, well, welcome, and we're going to talk about plankton tonight. We're going to discuss why they're important, what kinds of things are associated with plankton that you may not realize, and those kind of things. And I have pictures of a lot of that stuff. And then at the end, we're going to try to do a little bit of live plankton, but unfortunately today the plankton was almost all what we call phytoplankton, which I'm going to describe in a moment. But there was very little zooplankton in the sample because of the good weather. The phytoplankton have just really populated quickly. Anyway, go to the next slide. And what are plankton? And then push it again and it should give you, are they small plants and animals in the ocean? Well, certainly some of them are small animals and plants in the ocean, but they're not all, that's not always the definition of plankton. Plankton are actually, the next slide, they're passively drifting or weakly swimming organisms that are dependent on currents. Size is not really in the definition. So when people say plankton, don't think of them all as something you look at under a microscope. A large jellyfish, for example, that could be a foot and a half in diameter is actually considered a plankton because of that. And I'm going to describe all the different kinds of plankton that we have. So a large jellyfish, 8 inches, would be considered a plankton. And that's because it can't swim against the currents. So when people say plankton, it's not just stuff that we can't see with our naked eye, and use a microscope. So next slide. So plankton, oceanographers and especially marine biologists seem to love to classify everything into categories, and plankton are no different. Again, they're drifters of the ocean, and zooplankton, which you see in the slide here, zooplankton are animal plankton. Those are, in other words, just about everything that's a zooplankton. It can be quite a few titles actually, because zooplankton, a jellyfish, would be also a what we call a macroplankton as well, because it's bigger than a certain size. So zooplankton is a real common term used by biologists, marine biologists, to describe the plankton that are animals in the ocean. Phytoplankton, which is what we're going to see a lot of tonight in this slide, are actually plant plankton. Then we have other categories which people talk about. There's meroplankton, which only a portion of their life, and I'm going to show you slides of what it looks like as a plankton and what it grows into as an adult, and they don't even resemble each other. So a lot of organisms in the ocean, like crab and sea stars and those kinds of things, all start out as plankton, and they're drifting around in the currents, how they distribute with the currents. What? Oh, looking at the camera, okay. At any rate, so meroplankton are when they only have a portion of their life spent as a plankton. Holoplankton are plankton that are actually a plankton their entire life. Things like bacteria, like copepods, like the brochure that you've seen advertisements for. That picture of a copepod on that slide is a holoplankton. It lives its entire life as a plankton. It never grows into something that can swim against the currents. Macroplankton, jellyfish are an example, greater than 1 millimeter. I'm going to show you a picture of euphausids, which are a shrimp-like organism that actually can't swim very well against the current. And you've probably all heard that whales, like humpbacks and blue whales, are plankton eaters, and whale sharks and things like that are planktonic eaters. They're really eating macroplankton. Okay, they're eating fairly large organisms that are relatively good size. Microplankton, 0.075, nanoplankton, and ultraplankton are all very, very small, even smaller than what you're going to see tonight on some of the slides. We can't even see them with a microscope in some cases. Some are bacteria, viruses. Sometimes it takes an electron microscope to see some of these smaller things, but viruses, for example, in the marine environment are considered plankton that exist in there. And those are less than 0.005 millimeters. Nanoplankton are classified as 0.05 to 0.075. And I think there's probably a dozen more categories that they lump plankton in. So when you think of plankton, just think of the definition that they're drifters of the ocean, or they're those that passively get carried around by the currents. Next slide. So why are they important? They provide the primary food source for zooplankton, phytoplankton do, and together they're the base of the oceanic food chain. In other words, larger and larger zooplankton, eventually fish and mammals, are dependent on plankton for their survival. So just about everything we have in the ocean is dependent on survival. Salmon, for example, are very, very dependent upon copepods in the very first month of their ocean residence out there. They depend upon copepods. And I'll show you pictures of what they primarily eat. And they eat various kinds of copepods, and each salmon species actually will eat, it'll eat all of them, but they depend more on certain types of copepods. So they're very specific. Plant plankton produce oxygen through photosynthesis. Just like every plant on the land, they have photosynthesis, so they produce oxygen. They provide aquatic animals, as well as those found on land, with oxygen necessary for respiration that we exhibit as an animal. It is estimated that anywhere from 50 to 80% of the oxygen that's on the Earth's surface that people breathe comes from the phytoplankton in the ocean. It's that important. So we're talking about a very, very significant piece of chemistry, biochemistry that produces the oxygen on the surface. It comes mostly from phytoplankton. And if you think about it, the Earth's surface is about 3/4 covered with the ocean, and there's plankton in all of it. And believe me, the phytoplankton do much better in northern climates, so temperature is not a factor on most of that. In fact, the tropics have very little plankton in them. In fact, the reason the water, when you go diving in the tropics, is because the water's so clear and beautiful. Everybody always thinks it's real productive. It's not. The productive areas are places like Alaska and the Gulf of Alaska. The reason the whales come up here is because the plankton are up here. When they migrate south, they go down to Hawaii to breed, and they go down to Mexico and breed, but they're not going down there to eat. They're going down there to have young because it's easier on their bodies, but they come to Alaska and Alaskan waters and cold climates in order to feed, because the plankton actually thrive in our areas. That creates a tremendous food quantity from smaller plankton to phytoplankton to zooplankton to larger small fish, and then small fish are then food for larger fish, and eventually you get up into some of the bigger fish, and eventually we actually end up with every species being very, very dependent upon the plankton. The other thing that happens, they represent by far the greatest amount of photosynthesis in the ocean, phytoplankton do, and they trap most of the sun's energy, so it can be used by all other life in the sea. In other words, it produces, just like all plants produce various carbohydrates and things like that from the sun's energy by absorbing carbon dioxide in the presence of chlorophyll, and that produces oxygen as a byproduct, as well as sugars and things like that that can be used for nutrition and metabolic processes in animals. And phytoplankton use CO2, quite a bit of CO2, which can help with the warming environment as well as reducing ocean acidification. One of the problems we're seeing in the ocean right now is acidification, which it'd be a whole lot worse if it wasn't for phytoplankton in the ocean. Acidification means that the ocean is getting more acidic. It's still a base, but it's getting more acidic, and that can dissolve shells from the mollusks. It can cause all kinds of problems associated with productivity in the ocean. Next slide. So why are these plants and animals important? Because they represent, by far the most, the greatest amount of photosynthesis on the earth. They trap most of the sun's energy. Zooplankton represent the foundation of the animal life and are the first step in many of the food webs. Those are the primary reasons. Next slide. Okay, so how do we study it? We study it in several ways. It's always been done with a plankton net in the past, since very early time, which is a very fine mesh net that people have. And now we can actually watch plankton concentrations on the Earth's surface and the oceans by using satellite technology. And we can actually look at the color of the water. We can actually see the reflected light from phytoplankton. We can also see zooplankton. We can learn a whole lot using satellites. Next slide. And this is just a shot of chlorophyll right here off a Ketchikan. I took this off the internet a long time ago, 2007, but what it does is it's a scale that shows in milligrams of chlorophyll, which is associated, you can directly associate that with the number of plankton in the water. The darker spots on that graph are associated with more productivity. And you can see there's a lot more productivity in the inland waters as well as along the coast. The reason that is because although there's plenty of carbon dioxide in the ocean and there's plenty of plankton in the ocean, we also have to have nutrients in the ocean. And a lot of the nutrients come from the land. They come from decomposing plant life as well as animal life, and it goes into the water column, and then that provides nitrates and things, just like fertilizer that you would have in your garden. And that has to happen. Only in the case of plankton, we have a couple of different chemicals that are pretty important. Like iron is very, very critical, and so is things like silicone and those kind of chemicals. And that stuff is available coming off of the land through runoff in the ocean. Next slide. And that's just another more recent shot of another type of plankton called a coccolithophore, which is a small plankton that we experienced here recently, and I'm going to show you a picture of what that did to the Narrows out here. But it's a very, very small phytoplankton that occurred here, and it was an anomaly that we don't usually see. But you can see in this diagram there was quite a bit of coccolithophores right off of the Queen Charlottes, and it actually extended up into our inland waters. Next slide. This is typically what we used to use, plankton net. This is a 253 micron mesh which is a fairly large, used only to fish for or to sample zooplankton. And that's what I used today. And today there was so much diatoms and little chain diatoms and things like that in the water that it plugged the net immediately. And I may have used a net just about that size, maybe a little bit smaller than that. It looks like a meter net there. But that's typical, and this was a picture I took years ago on an oceanographic cruise in Glacier Bay. We were doing some sampling for zooplankton. Next slide. That's the net I used today, actually, and it's that picture was taken right off of a plane float that I was doing some sampling over on the West Coast from an airplane, and we were doing some plankton sampling. Next slide. Okay, this is typically what you see in a slide. When you take a sample like that, put a drop in the water, and what you're going to see in this slide, there's a larger critter up on the in the 10 o'clock position there, more towards the top to the left in the picture, and that is that's probably I'm just trying to look at that. It's probably a juvenile barnacle of some sort. And then you can see these other chain diatoms everywhere. There's little things that look like little dots, and they're in a line. Those are chain diatoms, and those are very, very important, and by far the greatest number of phytoplankton in the ocean there, and those are what produce most of the oxygen. Yes, next.
Jeffrey has a question.
Yes.
What can people in Ketchikan do to help phytoplankton thrive and create more oxygen for the earth?
Well, I don't think there's anything that we can technically do, because we can't really fertilize the ocean. There was a guy over in the Queen Charlotte that tried to fertilize the ocean with iron, and they were worried about that. They got real excited about it, the agencies in Canada. There's really no problem with phytoplankton right now. Anyway, I don't think the environment could handle any more phytoplankton in it right now than what we already have, and it looks pretty impressive out there right now. Visibility. 2 weeks ago, I was doing sampling for invasive species, and the visibility was 11, right around 11 meters. I could see down, and using a special disc that we use for measuring visibility. Today, it was under 4. So it's really got murky quick. Next slide. Okay, these are what these things look like. If you have, these are just diagrams, obviously, of them, and you're going to see that Cocinodiscus there. That's a round circular one, and they look like little round dots in the image that you'll see. Up on the left is a diatom called Catocyrus, and that's very prevalent in the sample today as well, and that's on the left there. And those little spines on the sides of it are actually made of silicon dioxide, which is the same thing glass is made of. And one of the things that everybody always asks, well, why do they have that? Well, the reason they have it is because they're plants, and the shell that they have around them to protect them are made of silicon, which is heavier than water, and it would sink. So the more spines you put on, the more surface area there is. It ends up being a situation that helps the plant stay at the surface. It doesn't have any way to stay at the surface otherwise. Although most of these plants do have other mechanisms, such as oils and air bladder or air bubbles and things. They can secrete like oxygen into their system to keep a little bit of positive buoyancy there, because they want to stay at the surface, because that's where the sun is. That's where they're gonna be able to do photosynthesis. Also in this slide is another important one, dinoflagellate actually, or a diatom that is pretty important. It's called Nietzsche there. And it becomes a thing called pseudonychia, which means it gets a chain of those things. Of those get put in a big chain. They produce a toxin that can affect human beings. It can affect our short-term memory. And how does it affect it? Well, you're not going to get enough, you're not going to swallow enough of those by swimming in the water or anything like that to get sick. But if an organism like a clam is filter feeding, it's going to concentrate that toxin. They're going to filter feed thousands upon thousands of those pseudonychia, that chain diatom, and it could become toxic. And it's never, I don't think pseudonychia has ever killed a person, but it has killed sea lions. I know that it has killed some marine mammals, other marine mammals. They think some of the gray whales possibly have been affected by it, and it affects it. And it's really bad on the nervous system. There's a lot of these chemicals that they secrete to stay afloat and other reasons for it actually are very, very toxic. The other ones on here are not really toxic type diatoms. They may change the water red color. So when you hear about red tides and things like that, don't depend upon that to be the key as whether the ocean is toxic or not. Go to the next slide. There's pseudonychia right there. I took that picture of the sample taken out here in the Narrows, and you can see that the nichia is that long string in the middle of the slide attached to each other. That's pseudonychia, and that's a HAB concern. And what they mean by HAB, if you ever see that term, it stands for harmful algal bloom. HAB is harmful algal bloom, and they are really, really a problem in some places. Especially in the Aleutian chain right now, we're really worried about it. They're having a massive die-off up there right now, I just heard about, and they think it's something that could be potentially associated with a harmful algal bloom. Next slide. So the Cattosaurus that we mentioned, these are the ones with the little glass spines. These are just pictures of what they look like, and they are real common, and there are a lot of it in the sample, even though the scope light has kind of burned out that would show it real well. But we'll see if we can make some headway on it here in a moment. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, these are dinoflagellates. This is a different type of phytoplankton. It has little flagella. In fact, they have two usually, and they have these little two whip-like structures are on there and they whip back and forth, and that's primarily associated with movement in order to keep it high enough in the water column to stay from sinking. We don't want these to sink because these are plants. They need to have photosynthesis. So they want to be at the surface. So we've got things like this Serratium there, which I've got pictures of. There's one up there called Goniolox. If you see that in the very middle there on the upper row, Goniolox is now considered to be called Alexandrium. This is the dinoflagellate that causes paralytic shellfish poisoning in shellfish, the thing that has killed people. This will kill people. The oil that's in there is a toxin to our nervous system, can suspend breathing and those kind of things. So that's a very nasty one. It's very small. In fact, these are not to scale. These, even though that thing says it's to scale, it's not. Those are very, very tiny, extremely small. You have to use a special plankton net to actually get those Alexandrium. Something in the 20 or less of a micron net mesh size, which is very small. These other ones get to be visually, you can see visually. In fact, the one in the right-hand lower corner called Noctiluca, there is one that you are all familiar with if you've lived here for a while, and I'll show you a picture of what that looks like in the ocean. It's very common. Go ahead to the next slide. There's Goniolux. Again, it's Alexandrium species. They renamed it to Alexandrium, and it's a harmful algal bloom concern. People have tried to come up with tests that you could test shellfish with a home kit and those kind of things. And it's not up in Alaska. We do not have one that is safe at this point. They have a few down in Puget Sound that seem to be good on those down there because they produce something called saxitoxin, which is what influences the nervous system. And so again, this is why plankton are important to understand, because they can kill you very easily. In fact, Goniolux we have extremely high concentrations of this. They get concentrated in things like butter clams, things like that. Some animals, like mussels, blue mussels that you see on the pilings and everything, they can concentrate this very, very quickly by filter feeding. They also can dump it very quickly out of their system. They don't hold it for a long time. So there are periods when you might get away with it, but you can't take the chance because it only takes one chance and it can kill you. There's no way, no wonder about that. And the concentrations are orders of magnitude above what is technically poisonous to us. So that's one that you need to worry about. It's why you should never eat any of the shellfish here unless it's been tested. It needs to be tested, and right now the only test is a mouse test, and that they're willing to buy in Alaska, and it's a very serious thing. You should be very, very careful about ever eating anything unless it's tested. And all farmed oysters, for example, are all tested. Gooey ducks, the farming industry that catches the divers do, they are always tested before they're allowed to sell them. Any clams are tested. So anything commercially sold, it's been tested, and that's so they're fine to eat. But you going out to the beach, be careful. It will kill you if you just happen to get a high concentration. Right now, there's quite a bit of plankton in the water, so we don't know whether any of it's toxic or not. Latest reports I had were that there is a lot of toxicity in the clams right now in this area. Next slide. Okay, there's that's another Diatom Dinoflagellate rather that is very common in this area. Go to the next slide. This one here is one that you'll see in tonight. I saw lots and lots of these in the sample I looked at. Cocinodiscus, it's got a lot of oils. Those are little chlorophyll packets that do photosynthesis, that are responsible for photosynthesis in those little dots in there. And they're fairly big and fairly easy to spot even with the naked eye. Next slide. That's another shot of them. Go ahead, next slide. And sometimes they put them under things like UV light, and they can glow in certain places, and they learn more about them. That's how they're studying some of these diatoms and dinoflagellates. Next slide. There's under an electron microscope, that same plankton under an electron microscope. So these things are small enough that we don't see a whole lot of them, even under a microscope. We have to have things like this is an electron microscope. Next slide. Next slide, that's just the same thing. It's part of the chain diagram. This is another one that is very common in this area. Next slide.
We have a question. Are you
Yes, go ahead.
So, are rock scallop abductors mussels collecting high concentrations of toxins?
That's a great question. We don't see a lot of the saxitoxin getting into the abductor mussels of any of the organisms, but they still are warning you not to eat anything that is a filter feeding, anything from a filter feeding animal. In fact, those organisms, like sometimes crab, for example, will eat shellfish, and they actually can transfer the toxin to crab. And so there's been people that have eaten what they call the butter inside a crab and have gotten sick and gotten paralytic shellfish poisoning from that. So you can always associate it with it, but I haven't heard of anybody dying or eating any of the abductor mussel stuff that has gotten them sick. They've looked at that, and even in gooey ducks and things where when they test them, they grind the whole animal up, and when they just do the parts that are normally sold for food, they don't see the concentrations that they see when they grind up a lot of the organs. So there's a lot of controversy over that, and there's a lot of people that are concerned about whether or not this is going to hurt their fishery and those kind of things. And how do you farm them if you end up getting them concentrated? But down in Washington, for example, they don't test for everything. They remove some of those organs that are not eaten, and they can sell more of the product. So we have a little bit of a different process up here. I'm sure that there are groups of people that are working on that in the dive industry, working and trying to get the law changed a little bit on that. I can't tell you that it's safe to eat abductor mussels. The pat answer is most people say don't eat anything that filter feeds. And of course, rock scallops are filter feeding organisms. But I've never heard of anybody getting sick off of them either. But it's not to say that they couldn't. Okay, next slide. Okay, this picture here, this is at Mountain Point, just right here in Ketchikan. And you can see the watercolor. And up in the left-hand side, there's a little picture there. That's a picture I took through a microscope of a Noctiluca. That's and very large. They're very large, by the way. They're large enough to see with the naked eye. It looks like a little spot of orange, but that is typical of Noctiluca. And people see those, and they always. I get tons of calls when the water gets this color. I get calls saying, "Is the water all toxic because of that?" And I say, well, the chances are that the bad ones like Alexandrium, Goniolox, and Pseudonychia and those things are probably blooming at the same time that Noctiluca is, because they're all experiencing the same thing. They got the nutrients, they got the temperature, they've got the sunlight. So the chances are they're all the same. But the actual thing causing this water to be the color it is not the poisonous organism that causes the mortality. So the next slide. This is a shot from an airplane of that same thing, and it's actually a bright orange. You can't see it in the picture here because it's it doesn't render it the right way, but it's in the actual photograph, it's very, very orange. It's almost iridescent orange. And this is from an airplane flying over Prince of Wales. I believe we were headed over towards Prince of Wales. It may have been down south here too, a little bit, down towards Boca de Quadra. Next slide. There's another shot, and this one is very prominent. And you'll notice it's all concentrated in one area. And you might ask, why is it concentrated in one area? And the reason is because of wind, primarily. These things are floating at the surface, and the very surface layer of water in which these things are existing, because they want to be at the surface. They want to be at the very top of the surface to get the maximum amount of sunlight. And so they've got oil sacs and those kind of things right in their system to keep them right at the surface. And that very surface layer does get carried and pushed by the wind a little bit. Okay? Next slide. This is another thing that is really interesting. This is going across Clarence Strait. Everybody always associates these drift lines that we see stuff floating like boards and seaweed and long lines. And they always associate it with two currents coming together. It's not always two currents coming together. This is a thing called Langmuir circulation. And what happens is when wind blows over the surface in a consistent manner, next slide, when wind blows over, it looks like this, but can you go to the, if you can, okay. What happens is when wind blows over the surface, we end up getting upwelling in certain places. And we get these circular patterns of wind that because the wind, if you look at that arrow is pointing towards the right upper side, and it causes circular circulation in the water column. And what that does is it pushes all the organisms and all the debris and everything into these long lines, and that's what that photograph was of Noctiluca was blooming in the water, and it concentrated the Noctiluca into long lines in the water, and you could see Langmuir circulation. So when you're looking at something in the ocean, don't always think that it's because two currents coming together. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the times it's just the wind blowing over the surface that can cause some circular patterns like this shows in this particular diagram. And that's a little bit of an oceanography lesson there, but we're using plankton to understand Langmuir circulation, which is interesting. Next slide. And you probably remember when the Narrows got to be this color, about 6 years ago or 5 years ago. The entire Narrows, and I got calls, so many calls about this. Everybody's saying, how come the glaciers are melting so quickly, and that's what's causing it? Yeah, the color looks like glacial water, but that's not what was going on here. This is plankton. This is a result of plankton. And this is a picture out in back of the University of Alaska Southeast Maritime Center down there. And I took this picture just to show what it looked like. And then I took samples of it. In the next slide, this is what I saw when I took the picture in the sample. You can see the Cocinodiscus up there, that round circle that you in there that I showed a picture of. And you see all these other little dinoflagellate. Go ahead to the next slide. And this is typical of what you see. There's a Cocinodiscus there that I mentioned earlier. And then all the other diagrams there are a little dinoflagellate that was occurring. And you see the little flagella on there, in fact, on the one. You can see it on, you can't see both of them. Probably the other ones are facing either up or down, and you can't see it. But the flagella is what drove the plant. And this is just a simple sample of it, and it was just covered with those. Next slide. I don't know whether we got, there's a Cocinodiscus again. But that particular dinoflagellate, by the way, was not a poisonous type of dinoflagellate, and it changed the water here. And it also had a whole bunch of what we call coccolithophores in it. And you'll see those in a moment here. Go ahead, next slide. So there's the sample. And you can see some of the Catossaurus, the thing with the glass spines up in the right side of this picture, along with, you can see a chain. It's a little blurry. It's not as clear as the others. But you can see that in there. You can see one of the Cocinodiscus there. Go ahead to the next slide. And this is typically of what I saw when I put it on very high power. And those little round circles are a thing called a coccolithophore that also changes the water color the same. Go to the next slide. And this is what that looks like under an electron microscope. Very small, and they look like a Star Wars Death Star. But they're calcium carbonate. These are not one of the few phytoplankton that are not made of silicone. They're made of calcium carbonate. And in fact, the ocean in the Bering Sea, there's very common to see these blooms of this. And that was also very prevalent in that sample. of that water in our narrows here. And it had nothing to do with sediment. There was no glacial meltwater or anything like that. It was totally filled with things like this coccolithophore. Go to the next slide.
So a question
Yes,
about
go ahead.
these slides. Are these samples just a single drop of seawater on a slide?
Those were about a single drop of seawater, yeah. Yeah. It was-
Busy.
Yeah, no, very, very heavy. So let's look at the zooplankton a little bit, real quick. Go to the next slide. Okay, there's a thing called radiolarians, which are silicon dioxide, and these are usually prevalent in there. I didn't see any today in the sample that I looked at, but there was none of these radiolarians. And again, they have spines for a simple reason. They want to be up at the surface also, not because they're doing photosynthesis, but they're up there feeding on the phytoplankton. They want to be at the surface because they want to feed on phytoplankton. So go to the next slide. And these are the common ones. The copepod, which is in the diagram that was on the poster for this thing, is up on the upper left side, called Calanus copepod. Those are the primary food for out migrating salmon. When you see these little tiny salmon going out to sea from the streams, those little juveniles, that's what they're eating. Primarily those copepods. We also have a thing in that picture called a chetonath. Those are deep water, but they're still plankton because they're moving around in the current. And I've got great pictures of those. They're a little thing called an arrowworm, and they're a very unusual animal. And they're very indicative to water that's very direct, like water coming out of the Mediterranean has a special kind of one of those that they look at the species for, and they can see whether any of that water is moving in those areas. So they use the chetonaths to do a little bit of understanding where the major currents of the ocean are doing. But there's only about 30, I think, species of them. So there's not very many, but there's tons of them here. And I see them, I saw them all the time with when I used a remote operated vehicle at deep water here in 400, 500 feet of water. You see tons of those down there. They're usually very deep. The thing on the right corner on the bottom is called a euphausia. That's a krill. You've all heard of krill, and that's what things like humpback whales and other whales will concentrate on those when they get together. And go to the next slide. I think I have a picture of, that's euphausids. That's that same thing on the beach at Buggy Beach or Rotary Beach. They just wash up on the beach because they can't swim against the current. And we had a real strong wind that day. It was blowing from offshore. There were whales right offshore bubble feeding these. And I think they stunned them with their bubble feeding. And then the current the winds just drove them right onto the beach. And they were probably 3 inches thick on the beach. The whole beach was covered with 3 inches of those, just thousands of them. Millions of them, I guess. I don't know. But there was a lot of them, I know that. And I went down and took a few pictures. I think there's one more slide of that. I think, yeah. There's one on a rock that I took of a close-up of the euphausid. They're considered mega plankton, large plankton, because they can swim a little bit against currents, but they can't really do much. And this is what our like humpback whales are feeding on, blue whales, those kind of things are feeding on those. The baleen whales feed on these. A lot of the baleen whales do feed on these by concentrating them into bundles by using bubble netting, and it concentrates them into a tight ball, and then they can swallow them. So this is these are euphausids, and we have a lot of them around here. Most people, they see those on the beach, they say, what's killing all that? In fact, this picture was taken right after Fukushima when the Japanese atomic power plant had the rupture and got into the water, and everybody wanted to know if they were killing our shrimp. They always thought these were juvenile shrimp. No, these are adults, and they're only about 3/4 of an inch long. And so they weren't shrimp, you know. They're
So-
related to shrimp, but
There's a question.
Yes.
So are these different from krill?
no,
That
these
you're
are
saying
krill. These are krill.
Okay.
These are krill. These are what we call, the common name for all the euphausids are krill. There's a whole lot of species of these. And this particular one is one that's very common around here. But this is a krill species. Yes. Some of them are a little bit bigger than this, too. Some of the pelagic ones, the ones that are out in the open ocean, are a little bit bigger. Go to the next slide. Okay, Calanoicopods. Again, pink salmon love these things as they're coming out of the local areas. In fact, people have done studies on Calanoicopods and related the survival and return rates of them. In fact, NOAA, their most successful predictive tool had to do with a lot of these kind of organisms, the early marine survival in the first month of the marine survival. We think that a lot of the survival of our fish, like salmon and those kind of things, are associated with the amount of food available for those organisms out when they're leaving the streams and transiting the inner waters and going out to sea. They did studies off of icy straits and places like that, and they were able to relate the pink salmon numbers to that. Others used to be that they related made predictions of how many pink were coming back, and it was very, very poor results. And they used things like the amount of fish that spawned in the creek and all those kind of things. Actually, these understanding the marine food resources and the early marine survival has been more effective at predicting salmon runs. And that goes for Chinook salmon and all the species.
Is
Go
there,
ahead.
is there a way to, this is probably messing too much with nature, is there a way to farm or increase the number of the copopods to help increase these
No,
salmon
not
runs?
really. I mean, there's plenty of them out there. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's differences. The other thing that's important, and I think I had mentioned it earlier, or with Michelle here, that what we're seeing right now is that in the open ocean, in the Gulf of Alaska and even into the Bering Sea, we're seeing a less desirable species of Calanoicopod that has less nutritional value. And it's causing they are starting to think that this is a link to why some of the runs are having more difficulty, is because the quality of the copepods nutritionally is not there. And it's probably more important because what it does is it doesn't affect the actual pink salmon as an adult, but it might affect like the herring and some of those other species that those larger salmon, feeding salmon out in the open ocean are dependent on. Their food sources are being affected by lower value copepods out there because they just don't have the nutritional value of the cold water. Copepods have some of the highest nutritional value. So go to the next slide. That's a picture, by the way, that I took a while back. And this little copepod there is another copepod, but it's got real short antennae. And by the way, the antennae on those are real long. And if you notice on that slide, there's all kind of appendages on there. The reason it being, it requires less energy to stay at the surface where they're feeding, because they're feeding on the phytoplankton. Go to the next slide. And look at this this is called a Herpactocoicopod. Look at this short antenna on that. It's a pretty blurry picture, but that is a Herpactocoicopod, and what they are is they're still a plankton because if they get into the water column, they get carried with a water current. But a lot of them hang out on kelp and things like that, on the rocks on the shoreline, and ends up that they've got very high nutritional value. And what happens is the chum salmon, for example, will seek out Herpactocoicopods before they'll seek out calanoid copepods. And the reason that being is so when you think of the early out migration, a lot of times chum salmon will be close to the beach, and pink salmon fry that are going to sea are out more in the open, because the calanoids are almost always out in the open because they've got all those large appendages, they've been able to stay at the surface. The herpactocoids are close to the beach. They also have a lot of oils and things in there, so they're brightly colored. They have all this yellow and reds and things like that when you look at them under a scope. And so they're very different looking critter, but apparently the chum salmon prefer them. And so we usually see chum salmon a little closer migrating along the beaches than in the open ocean. Go ahead. Meroplankton. Only a portion of their life are spent as a plankton. So let's go ahead and look at a couple of those. Okay, anybody have idea, if there's anybody listening out there, figure out what this is? This is a picture, a detailed picture of a zooplankton. And believe it or not, this is, go to the next slide. It's a barnacle. That's what a barnacle looks like when it's a plankton. Doesn't resemble anything like the barnacle on the side. And of course, they're crustaceans. They're related to shrimp. And most people don't realize that either. They always describe in biology classes that it's like a shrimp growing a calcium carbonate house around itself, cementing itself to a hard substrate, laying on its back and kicking food into its mouth. Because if you ever look, they have these little feet that are swaying like this, and they're fanning the food in. Go to the next slide. That's what it is. It's one of those. Okay, next slide. This is just an unknown. Actually, I think it's actually a crustacean as well. It's can't remember the name of it right now, but I think I know what it is. It's just a crustacean, though. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, this is an amphipod. In fact, that other one is an amphipod as well. And these are real typical. Go to the next slide. Okay, any idea what this is? I bet you won't get that either. Next slide.
As long as it's not dinner. Oh,
Yeah.
it is
It
dinner.
is dinner. It is a Dungeness crab plankton. That's what Dungeness start out as, a plankton. So when you think of plankton as being something important, crabs and everything. In fact, all the crabs have that same form of a plankton. Go ahead, next slide. There you go. Next slide. This one you probably know because it looks very similar to the adult. Next slide. It's a moon snail. Okay, next slide. Larval gastropod is what it is. Go ahead, next slide. This one's going to be hard to figure out.
Sea cucumber?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Go to the next slide. It's a Stichopus sea cucumber. Start out looking like that as a plankton. Next slide. Sea cucumber. They don't resemble it very well. Next slide. And that is obviously some type of gastropod or bivalve clam or something. Go ahead, next slide. What about this? Okay, go to the next slide.
Oh.
Sea star. It's one of the sea stars. It may not have been this species, but it could have been any species. I don't know. They all look about the same. You have to have a special thing to figure that out.
Speaking of special
Yeah.
equipment, somebody says, we have an enthusiastic 5-year-old watching. What level of microscope could you recommend for observing some of these plankton?
Well, if you're going to look at Phytoplankton, you're going to want to have a standard microscope. A dissecting scope is usually fine for zooplankton, like what we've got here right now is zooplankton is better because they all have different scales of, depending on what you want to look at, is really the answer. But you can pretty much see with just a standard microscope, like a binocular microscope with two eyepieces and something that goes up to, maybe 400 or 500 power or something like that. You can pretty much pick any of this stuff up. Go to the next slide. Okay, there's a clam. Go ahead, next slide. There's what the larval bivalve looks like. Next slide. And this is just a picture of one of the diatoms on a long line there. Next slide. Cathoceras. There's the little glass spines. And these are also important to understand for a couple other reasons. When these things bloom, and they have bloomed in places where people have net pens in the water and they're raising salmon, and those little spines have cut the gills. They get into the gills of fish, they get into the gills of the juvenile fish, and they killed off net pens. So those things are just like glass knives. So you got to be careful when you have Cathoceras blooms. Next slide. There's more Cathoceras. They have long lines. There's a lot of these in the sample that we had today. Go ahead, next slide. There's another copepod, and again, calanoid type copepod where you see the long antenna and a lot of appendages. All that stuff creates friction of settling. It will stop things from settling because it's just like a feather. You drop a feather and it floats down. The same thing happens in the water column, and it's just providing resistance of settling. And that's why a lot of these organisms have all these appendages and things like that. Next slide. Macroplankton, go to the next slide. Things like jellyfish. Next slide. That's a ctenophore. That's a ctenophore. These are organisms that they're jellies basically, and they're interesting. They have cilia along their sides, and they bioluminesce at night. They're really pretty, but they're all considered plankton. Go to the next slide. And there's the various kinds of jellyfish. There's the Portuguese man-o'-war there, which is poisonous, and the Aurelia there on the left is one that's common here. The moon jellies that we see in our area are there. Go to the next slide. Just jellies. Go ahead. There's the krill again. Just another shot of the krill. Okay, here's another one that we've been seeing a whole lot of with the warming water column out here, called a siphonophore. These are long. These can be 2 feet long. Okay, and but they can't swim, so they're considered macroplankton, and they're related to jellies, but they've been seeing a lot of these in the marine environment out here. Fishermen have been picking them up quite a bit and wondering what they are, and they're just an unusual macroplankton. Go to the next slide. Okay, now here's something that's also, I'm going to show you one of these tonight, a live one. This is called a Caprylid skeleton shrimp, and you can see these commonly on things like docks and things where you get these real fine mesh. People probably think they're algae, but they're really bryozoans and hydroids and things like that. They're long, stringy, like structures of animals and plants, and they hang on to those. But a lot of times they break off and they end up in the plankton category. So they're interesting. This is something we were looking at because the one on the left is native to here and the one on the right is not native to here. I have not ever been able to tell the difference between either one of them, so I just know they're caprylids. They're really difficult to think. I think the neck is the only thing, that one spot is the only thing that looks different to me. So that's it. Go to the next slide. We should be at the end
We have a
now.
question.
Okay, and we have,
Yeah.
we hear about the toxins that plankton
Yep.
can, have and the troubles they can cause, but has there ever been a medical benefit discovered from these toxins?
I don't know of any right now. The saxitoxin is a nervous, it can affect the nervous system. Now, I don't know whether they've done experiments to figure out if there's been a positive benefit. I know that back when I moved up here, the guy that was studying saxitoxin with the Alexandrium one was involved with working with the CIA,
Oh,
and they were
well.
gonna try to take out Cuba.
Useful in a different way.
Yeah, that wasn't useful, but that's I haven't ever heard of anybody. It doesn't mean that they're pretty strong toxins, so they might very well have strong medical value. I don't know the answer to that, but they've got a good. There's a lot of information on saxitoxin, so I would think if there was some use for it, they would have already figured that out. But I haven't heard of it. I'm not saying that there isn't, but I haven't heard of it. Okay? Anyway, we can go ahead and try to make the microscope work and show you at least the Caprylid. I'll grab that. Yeah, let's get some lights on and stuff, and we'll see if we can actually see anything with this microscope. Like I say, I don't think there's been unfortunately, we weren't very successful at the lighting in here with this particular. I'm gonna see if I can find that Caprylid. Get him over here. Yeah, he's right up at the top here. Get him. I'm just going to put this whole piece on here and see if we can get him to. Not sure where he's at. Okay, so let's get some focus here. There we go. There's a Caprylid right in the view now.
Wow.
See him moving?
Wow.
And he's living on that type of stuff that I was saying. That's a hydroid, actually. And
Hey, Jeffrey, maybe your 5-year-old wants to name this guy.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know. Come on, move, okay? Beginning to. There he goes. This is also considered a plankton. Like I say, you can see all the various calisthenics that he plays. You can see his eye there, an orange eye. I can see it with the microscope. I don't know whether that's clear in there or not.
It looks good on my screen.
Yeah, let's see if we can get him just a little bit farther in here. And then, yeah. Whole thing here, maybe. So that's a Caprylid. And you can't see the whole animal right the way he's structured here, but I don't know where I have my dissection stuff.
The question is, what magnification are you at right now?
Actually, it's probably 20 or 30 power right now, so it's pretty small and not really great. Yeah, over here. I'm getting in some water. Okay, now let's see what we can get. See them a little better maybe. There you go, now you can see them better. Seeing them okay? Yeah. You can see the long antenna. There's these other things moving a little bit. All right, there you go. That's a Caprylid. You'll see these on the docks at times, and again you can see all of his appendages there, and that's on the lowest power we've got there. So it's down at probably whatever that bottom one is. I can't see what it says. Probably 10 or 20 power, something like that. But these are, I don't know whether you can see, on the right-hand side of that image, yeah, you can see the antenna.
Do you want to use the mouse? You can use the mouse.
Oh, yeah, if it's possible.
You'll have to look at the overhead projector.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, there's the antenna right there. And these are the little flipperats there on the body. And you can see the little claws and things. He's got little claws on this arm. And he's got claws attached to the this is hydroid along here, which is a type of primitive animal plant cross almost. Anyway, yeah, you can see the thing. And let me see if I can get a good sample of water. If we can find anything else in here that isn't moving. Okay, now almost everything you see in this picture are little, let me see if I can clear this up a little bit. Leave it alone and see if it's any better. You can see the little, a lot of this is Catossaurus, by the way. You can't really see much with it. Let me go to the smaller power and then see if we can find something like a copepod. I saw jellyfish in there earlier, so. Just about everything you see in there are plants. All those are little diatoms and dinoflagellates. Let's try to get another critter if I can.
Right now, the only thing we're seeing on here is the Caprylid moving. He's still active. It's disappointing that we don't have better phyto or zooplankton.
If we'd done this in June or July, there'd be all this orange stuff, this or this small diatoms would all be animal plankton, like copepods and clams and barnacles. There's no barnacles in this, which is, I don't think I've ever taken a sample that didn't have tons of barnacles in it, and this doesn't have any barnacle mapulae in it. Usually you find all those things flourishing.
So just too early in the season? I mean,
Yeah,
we did, you know, we're having still very cold temperatures at night. And,
Does it have something attached to it?
I don't know. We may have grabbed something that was swimming by.
National Geographic moment.
Yeah, I don't see anything that I think is. He may have grabbed something, I don't know.
But I'm certainly not seeing what I wanted to see. Let me look at this a minute.
Normally, there's copepods swimming all over the place, and you
Can't see any of them in this sample. Hanging around with that stuff. Nope. Yeah, we're not seeing too much in here other than a lot of plants. So all those little plants are chain diatoms and things. But you can't see much of anything that's... Well, folks, I'm sorry to say it, it's just not a great sample.
Oh, yeah, I see something swimming.
Let me see if-
It swam by really fast.
Yeah, there's a couple little... And there's some right there. There's a... Get that focused. And that looks like it might be... That looks like a barnacle. I think, yeah, that's a barnacle. If you see that in the very center there of that, that is barnacle swimming. Did you see it there? No. I can see it in this, but I can't see it in the scope. Let's see if I can get that.
So we have another question.
Yes, go
So
ahead.
why is there more phytoplankton in cold water than warm water? And how do zooplankton reproduce?
Zooplankton have eggs.
And most of them have eggs. And that little thing swimming there is a that's a barnacle napuli. That's one of the beginnings of the barnacle.
That's the most famous barnacle on the planet.
Well, it is right now. Getting broadcast everywhere.
can see him there. Let's see if I can get him over here a little bit more.
And what about the cold water versus warm water? You think, oh, it's warmer, so there would be more.
Well, there's not as much nutrients for one thing in places like tropical areas. There's not as many nutrients, but there's also gas concentrations are much higher in colder water because gases dissolve in cold water at higher amounts than warm water. If you've ever heard of the streams, for example, around here, getting to be deadly because they didn't have enough oxygen in them, it comes from the fact that the streams are getting warm. And that means that there's less ability for the ocean to absorb oxygen and things like that. So the oxygen concentration is always higher in colder water. Now, there's some little zooplankton swimming around in there, and that's mainly you can see the chain diatoms there on the just below the Caprylid there. There's a little chain of diatoms. I can see it. And then a Photosynthesis right below it. But the Caprylid's disturbing everything right now. But that is definitely a Photosynthesis right there. I don't know if we can home in on that or not. That's as high a power as this has got. You can kind of see it there, but unfortunately the Caprylid's kind of stealing the show. Oh, there's a...
So let's say you don't have a microscope at home.
Uh-huh.
You know, how do you, can you take a little magnifying glass down to the
You
beach?
can see copepods and things like that. The Caprylid you'd be able to see really easy. These are big enough to be under just a little hand lens. And you can see the Noctiluca, that one that makes the orange, you can see that with a hand lens fairly well. But you're not going to see the little copepods very well. You can tell they're there, and you can see their structure a little bit, but it's not as good as a microscope. Microscope really makes it easy to see those things. And all this brown stuff is diatoms and dinoflagellates, and some algae too. There's also filamentous algae that start to grow. Well, I think that's about all we can do tonight. I don't think there's much we can do about getting more critters in there, but there's not very much zooplankton. There's just all phytoplankton, and you can't even see that very well. You need a stronger scope to really see the details of the diatoms. So for what it's worth, sorry that wasn't very productive in terms of viewing live stuff, but you did get to see Caprylid, which are kind of a cool animal. All right, well, thank you very much for watching, and you can always get a hold of me at the university if you need to, and sometime if you want to come down, I'll try to get a good sample, and we can look at under a better microscope.
And you're teaching oceanography this
Yes.
summer.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to teach oceanography this summer.